So one of the things when you chair a session like this, let me apologize as well for Dean Sudarshan, who had to leave on an unexpected event that he has to participate in outside of this NCR, and so could not be with us today. But one of the things that these kinds of events do is they make you read one more book, right? But this is just not one other book. I found it quite fascinating. I'm going to leave the commentary to our two learned colleagues who have spent a lot of time studying this book. And this particular author has spoken so often about his work and his book that he thought he wouldn't do that today. And he instead would react and respond to the commentary of our two colleagues, who I will give the floor to in a minute. But let me say, when I looked through this book, a few things caught my attention. And one was, it wasn't what I sort of was expecting when I looked at the title. So I was expecting to see a book on serious academic economics, so to speak. So that's the first one that caught my attention, was that it's written in really accessible language. And I found it, what was even stranger, we used to have, when I was in UNDP in New York, we used to have lots of fights with the World Bank, because we were mentored by Amartya Sen, and we were, as you know, UNDP favors the human development approach. So I was very engaged in that work in human development vis-a-vis the economic growth paradigm of the World Bank. Of course, when Sen won the Nobel Prize, the World Bank immediately appointed a vice president of human development, which they had no time for until that point. But apparently, Prime Minister Nehru had a vision of human development in his development objectives, the way he articulated what India should be, rather than a superpower demonstrating its powers on the global stage. Human development, where every Indian will have a fulfilling life, was his vision. So I learned all of that from this book, but I also learned that Professor Bala is interested in development as freedom, drawing from Berlin and Sen, and went on to, but he does look, after saying that this is what he will do, he then goes on to talk about political economy of India and the transition over the major periods as he identifies them. And then in the final chapter, I notice he comes back to talking about human development and what had happened to poverty and so on. But that's not my job. My job is really not to do too much about the book itself. I just want to demonstrate that I've read the book, and I will leave the commentary to our learned colleagues here. But one thing I'll mention to you that really struck me, and the point which we have argued elsewhere, and that is that in the mid-60s, poverty was being reduced while growth was slacking. Growth was declining at the same time that poverty was being reduced. I wanted to leave that one with you for that. Poverty reduction is impossible. Now, you can debate as much as you like. I wouldn't get involved in the debate. I would leave it to those more qualified to do that. But without any further ado, let me start with getting our two distinguished commentators to do that. And maybe, Professor Aditya, if I might start with you to do your commentary. 5-7 minutes, maybe. Academics can't speak in 5 minutes, so better take 7.
Well, actually, we're used to speaking like more 70-minute lectures,
yeah, exactly.
But it can be reduced to a capsule because I presume there'll be interaction following it. So some of the issues I wanted to raise can come up in the course of that interaction. Well, thank you for inviting me once again. I had a very pleasant experience here just a few months ago, and I see a lot of familiar faces around the table. This is a new experience for me. It's not a lecture. It's not a panel discussion. It's what's called an interlocution. I didn't even know such a word existed, but apparently there is such a word. And so let's see how we can manage it. I heard of an interlocutor because that's how Dean Sudarshan described my role. but then I found that there was actually a term called interlocution. So since I don't know how many of you have had a chance to look at the book or some of the reviews that have appeared, or I'll refer to Bala as Bala rather than as Professor Balakrishnan, because I've known him for only about 40 years. So as students in a much earlier incarnation. So I'm supposed to, it would be impossible to summarize this book, certainly in 7 minutes. So let me just point out 4 features of the book, which I think make it stand out from the many other publications that have come out this year on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of India's independence. Many of them have been written by people who have served in the government in important roles, recounting their contribution. And that, of course, has its own limitations, because they not only have to justify what they did and also give excuses for what they couldn't do, but since they served in the government in a period when a particular vision of economic policy was being promoted or became dominant, whether it was under the current government or the previous government, and many of those advisors successfully made the transition from one government to the next, because the underlying economic philosophy of both were the same. So they are limited in their framework, which they bring to their discussion. Bala, fortunately, being an outsider and an academic, can see things from a different perspective. And some of that perspective, I think, is extremely valuable. And I'll point out what exactly is different. One is, of course, what the Vice Dean mentioned, the focus on human development rather than GDP growth, or even just the unidimensional approach to poverty reduction. The other is a more macroeconomic perspective, because the underlying approach of the governments since the 1990s has been that economic reform, or the promotion of growth and indirectly development, is a matter of liberalizing unnecessary state intervention in the economy. Reform is identified with that process. Bala brings a different perspective, and I think a much needed perspective, that you have to look at the macro picture, in particular, the kind of issues that people like Alan Young, John Maynard Keynes, Nicholas Caldor, and so on adopted. That is, one has to look at the, even if in a capitalist, largely capitalist economy, there has to be a focus on the inducement to invest, which cannot come only from supply side reform measures of reducing controls and reducing corporate profit taxes, but also from a reliable, steady source of autonomous demand, as it used to be called, exogenous demand, demand that is exogenous to the capitalist system. And in Bala's perspective, that source of demand can only come from public investment, which not only provides a boost to demand, but also in the creation of infrastructure, in the provision of capital goods, which the private sector may find it unprofitable to invest in. The role of public investment has to be given much more prominence, in fact, a central role in the discussion. In other words, he recognizes a demand constraint. He has a particular theoretical formulation, which may actually be unfamiliar to most students and even scholars who have not been exposed to that so-called heterodox tradition of macroeconomics. So I would invite him in a few minutes after Anjana has made her points to maybe spell it out, because it's not something which is taught anymore in most universities of the world. At one time it was, but it has fallen by the wayside. That particular macro perspective. It is not simply Keynesian counter-cyclical fiscal policy that any government expenditure, as facetiously called, paying people to dig up holes and fill them up again. That is not what he has in mind over here. And final point is being an outsider and not party to any particular government's policy, not being affiliated to any particular school of thought or any political persuasion. He brings to bear a very even-handed treatment of all the governments since independence. And the subtitle of his book is A Brief History. And so he's not writing only as a chronicler of economic reforms or economic development. It is also a history drawing on political economy. And of course, when there are issues of political economy, people will have very different views. So maybe Bala will share with us the particular perspective he adopts. But it has a balance. He has some good things and some bad things to say about pretty much every government. And I think his early work, from which this book eventually emerged, was to rehabilitate the legacy, economic legacy of Jawaharlal Nehru. Some of you may have read his first article on this, which was engagingly entitled The Recovery of India, of course, playing on the title of Nehru's own famous book. And he showed that, and this was written before the current government came into power, and tried to systematically discredit the Nehruvian legacy on every front, including the economic. He showed that there were very impressive achievements of that era, not what people talk about now, including Nehru's heirs, that is the great institutions that were built, the IITs, the IIMs, the AIMS, the River Valley projects, the temples of modern India. Bala shows, using data, that contrary to the general impression, there was no systematic neglect of agriculture thanks to the Mahalanobis model. In fact, agricultural growth was remarkably good during the Nehru years, and the famines of the mid-60s came after that. Maybe it had run its course. The public sector, contrary to the general impression that people have nowadays, the public sector in the Nehru years was actually turning in surpluses for the government. It was not the chronic loss-making sector that it came to be criticized for. He also shows that despite the so-called heavy industry bias of the Mahalanobis model, there was no systematic neglect of employment and what we would today call development in a broader sense. But, and this is why I say that he's being very even-handed, he really packs into Nehru and his government for its, I would say, criminal neglect of school education, which has continued down to the present day. And since I've been reading Bala's work over several years since that first article, I noticed that his criticism on this count has, if anything, become much sharper. When I reviewed his earlier book, I said that, well, maybe he needed to be a little more critical on this. And indeed, in this book, he really does not mince any words on that count. So those are I think, the high points of this book. I think each of these four has some, I would say, gaps or silences or limitations which at least I would like to raise, but maybe we'll take that up in the course of the interlocution. And I think I've exceeded my 7 minutes, but I was told to summarize what I felt this book is all about. And so maybe I may be given a couple of minutes of grace.
I had requested you to do that, so thank you
Yeah.
for explaining to the audit what the book's about.
And thanks very much, Professor Aditya, for your great interlocution. And let's turn now to Anjana. Professor Anjana, please. You're going to take notes of the questions, comments.
Sure, of course.
We'll do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. Let me start by thanking the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be discussing Professor Balakrishnan's excellent new book, and I'm looking forward to the discussion that we'll have today. So the overall theme of the book, which Professor Aditya has already spoken about, is essentially have the goals that were set for post-independent India, basically ending poverty, ignorance, disease, inequality of opportunity. Have they been achieved in the 75 years after that fact? And what were the challenges to achieving those goals? And Professor Balakrishnan actually looks at them through different political regimes, all with the underlying approach of looking at, as Professor Singh and Professor Aditya have already spoken of, looking at the distinction between negative and positive freedoms, as well as very effectively using Amartya Sen's capability approach. So let me make 5 observations that I found interesting about the book. And then in the next round, we could perhaps look at further points for discussion. The first thing that I found personally very striking about the book, and in different parts of the book, it kept occurring to me, that there's this wide breadth of literature and sources that have been used to build the arguments. So there are citations of literature of political theorists, philosophers, sociologists, along with economists. And I think that's a lesson to all of us on how to engage deeply with socioeconomic questions with the breadth and the depth that they deserve. And I found that particular strength of the book. And the second is actually related to what Professor Aditya just spoke about, how there's a plurality of frameworks and perspectives, different ideas that engaged with. And I think that really contributes to actually increasing our own conviction in the arguments that are being made. And for instance, if I can take up one example that keeps coming up across the book, it is the reference to crowding in. How public investment can actually increase and encourage private investment, as opposed to the very popular conception of state spending being inefficient. And that's a theme that actually comes up quite frequently. And in relation to that, I'd like to bring up the motivation that is mentioned at the beginning of the book, which is that students often seem to lack an appreciation or an understanding for India's economic past and how that could actually help us understand the present and what we could do in the future. And that, again, I think is something that the book is very, very successful in doing. It's an excellent example of how we can actually draw conclusions from economic history and how we can actually use that, support it with empirically grounded evidence, and actually use that to draw lessons. And that, again, I think is very, very useful. Related to that, I would say that the book is actually far beyond the objective or the theme itself. I think it's actually a very effective tool for pedagogy. So as a teacher, whenever I'm reading something that I enjoy, I try to figure out ways that that can be used in the classroom. And I'm very happy and very excited to note that I think this book would be very effective in that respect. So there are many passages, many excerpts that can be used and used with students across different topics and different issues. So when there is references to Keynesian theory or Malthusian ideas, principles of roles, the role of Mahalanobis in contributing to the planning process, there's a quote by Ambedkar. So there are many, many contexts and topics where the book could be used, I think, very, very effectively as a pedagogical tool. And that is where I think what Professor Naresh was talking about how I think everybody who reads the book would comment on how accessible it is, while always being very careful to make references to the more intense academic work that the author and the others have engaged in, which would build the arguments further. It's very, very accessible for anybody who's interested in these broad questions. Let me sort of stop here with one line from the last chapter of the book. And the chapter is called Unfinished Journey. And incidentally, the chapter titles are also very pithy and poetic. And the line from the book is that there's nothing inevitable about the low levels of capability development in parts of the country. And although the title itself is, of course, rightly pointing to how our journey is unfinished, I think this particular line is very optimistic. And I think it's a good note with which we can actually plan the rest of our journey. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, thank you very much, Anjana. And if I might, Professor Balakrishnan, add 2 points to the discussion, and then I'll let you do a first round of response, then we'll go around and get some audience engagement. And those 2 points are, one, you conclude that there's still a significant section of the Indian population that is riddled with disease, ignorance, and poverty, which are the hallmarks of the lack of human development. And you go on to speak to the regional, contextual disparities that might explain some of that. So I'd ask you to comment a little bit about whether central policy planning, whether it be macroeconomic or human development, has failed in those regards as overall. And whatever improvements we see in human development is largely driven at the local level, which is the impression I get. That's one point. And I thought it'd be interesting for you to comment on this government's, this regime's, among others, the 2, I think, sort of fatal flaws in their economic thinking. At least 2 I'd like you to react to. One is monetary policy of the Modi regime. And the other one is a lack of understanding of the forces that drive the economy. I think those were the 2 big points you observed as challenges with this administration. Might be good for you to react to. I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Wonderfully welcoming introduction. Probably far more than I deserve. So I'm truly appreciative. Now, what do I say and how do I say this as far as Aditya's points are concerned? Are just 2 that I want to respond to. One I'll respond to, one I'm not sure how I can really respond to, but I'll make it clear why I can't respond to it. I'm not so sure, but he can probably goad me and we can probably have a interlocution there. So the point is about political economy, and he's absolutely right that what I consider political economy and what at least one reader has recognized as political economy will probably not be considered political economy by a lot of Indian political economists. So, for instance, I mean, while there is recognition of poverty and the industrialists as a class, surplus farmers as a class, the whole analysis is not a kind of Marxian political economy, nor is it what a terminology which is not probably widely known, neoclassical political economy as in public choice. But it's political economy, certainly, and I think quite upfront, and I'd like to believe reasonably successful in the sense of trying to explain a lot of Indira Gandhi's economic policy in political terms or in terms of the political compulsions she faced and also of the Narendra Modi government. So it is political economy in that sense. And there's probably also a little bit of political economy in trying to understand how we could really have ignored schooling in the way we did, right? There's clearly some political economy there. I mean, there's kind of the blatant elitism of policymaking in India. it's also stupid, right? Because if you don't educate your population, you just cannot absorb ideas from the rest of the world. Even if this technology is developed in India, it cannot be used, right? Because human beings man the machines or operate the machines, and if they're not educated. Now, this is a expression used in the case of Japanese economic growth called social capability. It's a bit of a clumsy word, but I think what they have in mind is the ability of societies to absorb ideas, in particular technology. And it's believed that there was a conscious effort by the Japanese government to try and locate the best technology in the world and bring it to Japan. And that was only possible because there was a tremendous emphasis on education, lasting not just for 5 or 10 years as Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan or something, but decades of trying to raise their levels of education in schools and colleges, etc., etc. I'm not apologetic about that, but I just want to say political economy, I think Alta is right. It's not political economy in the academic sense of the Marxian school or the neoclassical political economy, where people are just pursuing their economic, narrow economic interests. The larger things, people also want to preserve power. There's a little bit of discussion of that also, I think, in the final chapter. Which I'll come to. So that's the first one. And I'd like to believe, certainly in the case of Indira Gandhi, my analysis is reasonably successful. Now, on the second point, Aditya, which you very you praise, but I'm a little bit of a spot about explaining heterodox macro. I'm not sure. It's like sometimes you do things without really kind of understanding or being overly conscious about what you're doing. So I'm not sure what I can do to clarify what I do in the book, which is heterodox. But you're right. I mean, when I talk about the role of public investment, et cetera, I talk about it's both. It's a dual role of creating demand in the economy, which is absolutely essential, and also that it can create infrastructure which actually leads not just to growth, but just allows people to lead better lives. I mean, we don't realize it, but in many cities in India, the poor live beside sewage canals. They're not just even sewage pipes anymore. Right? They're sewage canals. I mean, so you can imagine people get sucked into potholes during what's the word, during the monsoon, because water covers the potholes, even in very wealthy parts of the country like Bombay, Mumbai. And of course, nobody needs to be reminded of Morbi now. So infrastructure is also necessary to just allow ourselves to lead more dignified lives, right? I mean, apart from, anybody who's stuck on the highway to Jahangirpuri for hours, just hours, you really begin to wonder, what does it mean to say things like we are the fastest growing economy in the world, we are this, we are that? I'm just flummoxed as an economist. I just don't even begin to understand that discourse, which everybody seems to participate in. Because you're worried. It's like, what's it called? FOMO. If you don't, fear of missing out. If you don't participate in it, it suggests that you're somehow dehati. You don't know all this, these terminology. So you participate in that yourself. But it's a mug's game. It's not taking us anywhere. It's not making Jahangirpuri any closer to me as a resident of Ashoka, right? So I do think of public investment also in that sense. You're quite right, not in the simple Keynesian sense of demand management and counter-cyclical policy, but public investment is absolutely essential as it can be an engine of growth, can improve our lives, and it's an engine of growth by acting on the demand and supply sides. That's about all I can do, Aditya, unless you quiz me a little more on the heterodox macro thing. But I just wish to say it's kind of interesting. There's nothing focuses the mind than a hanging tomorrow morning, they say, don't they? So after 7 years of actually poo-pooing kind of stimulus and talking about we are responsible government, etc. The Modi government has now increased public investment by a historic high in the 8th or 9th year, whatever this is, with public investment rising by 25%. And if there's anything that seems to be holding up the Indian economy now is that. So much for public investment. The other very small point that I want to make is that it's kind of interesting to look at the data. Every single turning point in India as far as growth is concerned. With your permission, Mrs. Singh, may I please put up a slide which the organizers have been very good with? Yeah, they can I just have the first slide, please? Yes. It's not so much the growth rate that I want to focus on here, but you're right, it's a growth rate one. That's absolutely correct. Yeah, that one. And we can have it off as soon as I made my point. I just want to say that every single turning point in 1952, 1979, 78 is the last year, 52 is the last year. So the acceleration starts from 53. And you will be surprised from 2004, which is the period of the highest rate of growth in India ever achieved, have been led by public investment. Now, and I don't want to be some kind of come across as some kind of Stalinist who believes in, big government machines, etc. But it just so happens public investment drove the turnaround, and you got to accept it. And it's important to understand it and understand its role. So that's the simple point that I wanted to make about public investment. So that another thing, you're absolutely right in having spotted the point about education in the Nehru era, which I call a momentous neglect. I mean, that was a time it was possible to do that without a great deal of additional expenditure. The amount of money you needed probably was really very small. And maybe we made too quick a move to higher and technical education at that time. And everybody's proud of the IITs and the IIMs. So am I. I work in an IIM half the year. It provides me my livelihood. But I'm not sure whether for 35 years, having produced graduates who leave for the United States the next day, such as is smart economics. I don't think it is. And there's some talk about, well, they actually paid it back in the IT boom. But let me just say two things about the IT boom. The biggest companies are all Indian. Wipro, Infosys, TCS. There's a fourth one. I forget. Who would be a fourth? HCL. Sorry? Tech Mahindra. They're not so big, but Tech Mahindra, HCL, they're all Indian companies run by, Indian engineers. Some of them went to IIT. Some of them didn't even go to IITs like Narayana Murthy. So I'm just trying to say, maybe made that move a little too quickly. But Aditya has this very interesting point. You may not remember, Aditya, but when the 2007 article was published, you used a very interesting word that you needed a techno-managerial elite. That's very well put, right? That's what the IITs and the IIMs were creating, that they created a techno-managerial elite in India, etc. But we seem to have severely neglected the fact that you need an educated population if you want all this technology to seep through the economy, right? And you missed out completely on that. Not to mention women's education. It's probably even more so. Women are disproportionately responsible for the raising and education of children, at least in the earliest stages. If they're not educated, if they're not in good health, you're going to have a population which is not has not sufficiently high human capital. So anyway, so you're right. I emphasize that a lot. And I just want to say one of the things that I'm mighty pleased with, if I might say, about my own book is being able to ferret out something, the debates in pre-revolutionary Russia, where they talk about, there's a wonderful quote, I don't know if you noticed it, but it makes sense to you, where the author is talking about how education matters more than tariffs, subsidies were used. And a third point, I don't know what it is. And that's a point, we just spend all our time discussing tariffs, subsidies, or tisra kuch hai, I don't know what it is, but not schooling. And this was said in 1898. And many of India's leaders of the national movement, much more so in the 1950s, probably like to flash their communist sympathies, etc. But they just didn't learn the right lessons from either pre-revolutionary Russia or Soviet Russia. And there's a wonderful quote from the Hindu, again in 1920s, which at that time was a very conservative newspaper, nationalist but conservative, actually speaking about this terrific job that the Bolsheviks were doing, even though the Bolsheviks are a menace to humanity. It's beautifully put. Yeah, but nevertheless, they're doing so much for in terms of health and education. That's the point. And you don't need to be reminded. The Russians reached Berlin first. Does it mean that we condone Stalin's labor camps? We don't. But they built a great industrial country, an industrial society, and that would not have been possible either without education or without public investment. So that's a small thing to wrap up. Anjana, what do I have to say to you? You were very kind in the things that you said. I just want to say, to add to it by saying that one of the things that I want to remind the audience, I guess that didn't come out sufficiently even in this discussion, but it never does. People are, not any of you, but generally anywhere else, people are transfixed by the idea of a comparison of Nehru and Modi. I don't of course, give the cat out of the bag at the beginning by saying there's no contest really, but that about they're transfixed by the possibility that that's what the book is. But the book is not about that. The book is about, we are at 75 now, and please, we are a democracy. So we should assess ourselves at 75 in terms of whether the goals of democracy are achieved or have been achieved in India. And that's what the final chapter is about. And it is correct, as Anjana said, it's titled Unfinished Business, and subtitle is Modernization Without Development. I meant human development, but the title would have been unwieldy if I put that in. So that's what we're doing. We're modernizing. Now we have aircraft production. I think it's a great thing. My father was an Air Force officer, so I have some sympathies with India's defense services. So it's great to know that the private sector is moving into defense production. I'm personally very proud of it, I would say, and so many other things. A digital payment infrastructure, great. I enjoy using it, and Wi-Fi and all the rest of it. But I did see something from a photograph in today's newspaper from Rajkot in Gujarat, where in a government school where the children are sitting on the floor. Is it absolutely necessary? Should you sit on raw cement, in schools, when so much is spent on higher education? And we are just, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot by just ignoring the part of the population which really matters to us, which is going to, protect the country, the borders, man our machines, run our locomotives, and all the rest of it. It's just and I would say that both ends of the political spectrum have done this. I mean, the right are just kind of obsessed with something called economic freedom. The left just wants lots of nationalized industry, it seems to me, no matter what is happening in schooling, or whether there's real infrastructure, or the nalas are full of sewage, or all of that doesn't seem to matter. You just have to hold on to Air India till kingdom come, even if it is draining the country. So that's, so the point was really to ask once again a question, to point out we are a democracy. What should we look at when we're 75? Should we be looking at, are we ahead of England or not in GDP? Or should we be assessing this in terms of what was promised in 47? And I think Nehru was not just speaking for himself, or not just speaking as probably the most prominent Indian of that time. Gandhi had already faded even before he was assassinated. But that was what the country believed the country should be like, where there would be human development, where people are able to lead fulfilling lives. And the point of the book is really to make that point and to, in some way, assess the distance we have traveled, and to point out, and now finally, Professor Singh's point. Yes, I do say that there are vast areas. As far as human development is concerned, there is a significant percentage of the population which is nowhere like in a position to lead the kind of lives they would like to lead. But I would also say there is regional variation in India. So, it is important to recognize that regional variation. And let me just give you an idea. The government's data from Niti Aayog 2021. I think it's based on NFHS data 1921. All of you know what NFHS is, of course. And it's computed the multidimensional index of poverty with an institute in Oxford. And some of the, just to give you a stark comparison, the multidimensional index of poverty in Bihar is 51%. It is 0.7% in Kerala. I'm not sure I would, go by so strongly those numbers, but it does speak of tremendous variation within the country, right? And now comes a question. If we are a democracy and the laws are broadly the same across the country, why should there be such variation? And the answer is, as far as human development is concerned, in any way, human development is concerned, perhaps local initiatives matter most. And there are state governments in India are very large, they're quite powerful, they can make a difference. Now, to human development and development in general, and growth too, which I'll come to. And what you're seeing here, the difference between the states of India is basically that, in my view, there's been greater social transformation in some parts of the country, which make democracy reach its full potential, whereby if you wish, the interests of hitherto excluded groups now begin to get taken care of in the public policy in the form of better provision of schooling, health, etc. I just want to get a quick line in by saying that the example of Bihar and Kerala was just to make a point. I don't personally think Kerala is a society which is perfect, far from it, and I've written about it very critically. And I have an article which is titled Kerala and the Rest of India, what do we have to learn from one another? So I think Kerala has a huge amount to learn from the rest of India also. But this figure about the multidimensional index of poverty varying so much is just making the point that there's huge variation. Why is that so? I give the argument that it has to do with social transformation, and democracy itself begins to work differently when there's social transformation. And otherwise you just have democracy in name, but not democracy de facto, if you wish. You have the legislative process, you have, what's it called, elections, but you really have no human development. That's exactly what it shows. Now, the point that Dr. Singh asked, while I say this, I don't by any means take a very strong view that central planning, obviously planning of the kind that you had in the 1950s is not something we should even try, for the simple reason the population is not for it today, but it had a purpose at that time. And I strongly believe that if we didn't have central planning at that time, it's not clear to me, or let me put it more politely, it has not been made evident what other kind of economic policy could have brought about the transition or turnaround in India in 1953, other than the policies of the government of the day, in particular, to use the expression that Sukhamoy Chakravarti has used, which is the Nehru Mahalanobis strategy. Everybody, again, rather like Nehru in India, know the Mahalanobis model and are focusing on it, how much, but I think Chakravarti uses the right term. It's a strategy which matters, which was to try and invest in different parts, both in different parts, different parts of the economy, not geographically, different parts of the economy, steel, transportation, capital goods, etc., and try to get the economy moving. And I think I would find it very difficult to think that any other policy could have done it, or it has not been demonstrated to me by people who use words, terminologies such as constriction of freedom, Hindu rate of growth, whatever that is, etc., etc. These are wonderful terms, but I don't think enlighten us one bit. So that's really it. So that's a point about central planning. And of course, one other area which I think where the central government did have a very important role, and that's also goes a little bit away from the idea that a lot of successful people in the IT sector have, that the IT sector, we are told, did so well because it was below the government radar. I don't buy that at all, for the simple reason the raw material in the form of the skilled manpower was entirely created in the public sector, and people don't know this sufficiently. The investment was basically in Hyderabad and Bangalore, we are told, because the government of India wanted these investments very far from the western border. So it is not accessible by enemy aircraft, but which meant this kind of public investment in Bangalore and Hyderabad, which lasted for 40 years, created a huge skilled manpower, which could immediately be hired for peanuts by international companies to do coding very successfully, et cetera, et cetera. So there, I do believe the central government did have a very important role, a coordinating role, favorable tax incentives and these things called software technology parks. You've heard of them, right? I mean, STPIs, where they had, most importantly, very swift communication channels, which is what is needed for software, right? Because you're sitting in India and providing software for American companies, which needs to be communicated. This is made available, water, electricity, fiscal incentives. In fact, NASSCOM itself actually acknowledges it. So I do believe that centralized interventions do matter and have mattered in India. The final one, which I spend a lot of time in the book, is the Green Revolution. Again, I just want to stop for a while and say that you're probably aware of the work of this economist, Mariana Mazzucato. Right? Have I got it right? Okay, Mariana Mazzucato. She has this term called the entrepreneurial state, and she's trying to argue that unlike in a certain strand of economics, the state can actually be entrepreneurial, and she has these examples. And the example she uses, interestingly, is the moon mission. There's a word for it. I'm not the Apollo mission. There's a word. I don't get it. There's a terminology American use. But let me just tell you, I mean, if you ask me by global standards, the Green Revolution should count as an instance where the state played a tremendous entrepreneurial role in India. And it is politically extremely significant. And my students at Ashoka University, I shouldn't be disloyal to Ashoka, but Ashoka University and in the IIM, which are so different, like chalk and cheese, if you wish. One a liberal arts private university, the other government management, but they are completely united on one thing, that as far as they're concerned, India's economic history starts in 1991. So if I was not an old man, I might have thrown myself into the Yamuna by now. But anyway, I'll finish very quickly, sir. But 1965, mid-60s, in the Green Revolution, it was a tremendous achievement, and people forget the politics of that time, what India was facing. The only thing that I disagree with, which also used with my student, not disagree, I take a different view. There were no famines in the mid-60s. There were food shortages, quite severe, right? Though you're right, the famine-like conditions in Palama, Bihar, etc., but shortages, not like the famines of colonial era, 43 or Deccan, Madras, 19th century. Anyway, nothing comparable. But the politics is important, as you know, this famous quote from Johnson to his staff after Indira Gandhi had visited the United States, send food to India by the shipload. So that she's kept on a short leash. So I think the people today have no idea of that time, So what the Green Revolution achieved is just absolutely miraculous. And the role of the state is very important. Of course, we know with hindsight, there were two severe mistakes that were mistakes at that time. It relied too much on fertilizer, which is ruining the soil quality. It gives farmers the unfettered use of groundwater, which is driving the water table down in Punjab. There are estimates by the leading Punjabi agricultural scientists that there could be desertification in Punjab by 2030, in 2022 now. And finally, giving the impression to the farmers and a whole lot of other individuals who are do-gooders in some sense, etc., who believe that a producer group in India, in this case the farmers, are entitled to actually produce as much as they want and have the government adopt it from the public, buy it at the public price, a public purse, whatever the price, and allow it to rot, which is actually a dead weight loss for the economy. So all that was very wrong, but at that time was a tremendous achievement, and it was achieved by the state. So that's all that I wish to say here. So maybe monetary policy and architecture, I'll hold back on,
sure.
for the simple reason I'll probably hold up the discussion if I.
Yeah, we do want to get some audience.
Yeah, of course. So
Yeah.
I'll come back to that. And
Right.
we can talk about that.
No, wonderful, wonderful. You see, you have this audience rapt attention. So. But I'm sure many people want to intervene. You remind me of, I was at Pusa Institute during that late Green Revolution. Late early 70s.
Yeah, right.
But Swaminathan, who was one of my teachers,
So who was?
MS Swaminathan, but we were taught that your sole job was to bridge the gap between actual and potential yield.
Right.
That's the education.
Right.
Everything else was not to be taken seriously at that time. But anyway, that was a different time. So let's open up and have a few. So let's see, one hand, two hands. No. So Subhashish and Sudeep. Sudeep goes first. Then we have one at the back there. Yeah. And we're going to come around. We'll take a bunch.
You
Because,
prefer that?
yeah,
Okay.
because we won't have time.
All right.
We need to wrap up by 4. So
Yeah, actually,
people have to teach and all.
Yeah,
Yeah,
fair
yeah.
enough, fair enough.
Please, and let's be brief in our questions.
thank you very much. I think that I just bought the copy, so I have to read more. Actually, I'd just like to mention.
So you teach.
Yeah.
All right.
My name is Sudeep, and I teach areas in economics and mainly economics, but we are also working in a particular area called complexity economics, complexity science applications in economics. So actually, my question is also related to that in a way that you mentioned a lot about social transformation. I think that's a huge point, and that's completely a new way of looking at, rather than top-down approach or right and left approach. And that is very compatible with complexity science view also, the emergence view. So I would also like to know about, there is one particular term like learning society. There's a book by Stiglitz and Greenwald, Creating a Learning Society. So that view might be very well compatible with the social transformation view. And what kind of public policy orientation we need to kind of cultivate more and more that kind of a learning society? That is my.
Yeah, I think should we get a few?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
No.
So Ashish, quickly.
I teach
Right.
political scientists.
Right. Right.
Question for you, you sort of reached for the Bolshevik box. So my question is, how can, when you talk about why don't we have an educated workforce, how can we get around the question of democracy and dictatorship, right? All the successful examples, in East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, all of these were able to educate their workforce. Pretty much, they were able to produce an educated class, people, because at the same time, they're also suppressing democracy. They produced a disciplined workforce because they had all sorts of restrictions on labor rights and things like that. Even Japan, actually, we don't realize this, for a long time under single party rule. So we can't do that. We possibly cannot do that. So I guess our challenge is, how do you do this in the framework of
Democracy.
democracy? So I'd like to hear your views of that.
Can answer that immediately.
All right.
Yeah,
All right.
thank you.
So exciting.
Have you finished?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I'm very fortunate because Amartya Sen has done my work for me. In his work, he dwells on this point, and he just gives a very simple example. The argument made in India that we should have stronger policies about family planning, population control, vasectomy, etc. And his example is that of Kerala again, which has achieved the demographic transition in a complete democracy. That's his first point. Now, the other point, which is interesting, where he doesn't bring in democracy, but his own data helps me answer your question. He looks at the literacy rates in rural China and literacy rates in rural China, and then he points out, this is a very nice paper by him and Jean Drèze, you should look at it, and literacy among rural women in Kerala. And Kerala has lower illiteracy among rural women than every Chinese province. Now, does this mean that I'm a chauvinistic Malayali and think Kerala is the cat's whiskers? No, it doesn't. Kerala sucks in many ways. I mean, I'm not sure it's very democratic in some ways.
Maybe that is why.
Governments have discouraged entrepreneurship in a serious way. So Malayalis have to migrate to the Gulf. But these transformations can be made without dictatorship. It's absolutely clear.
I think, Professor, but I would say, I won't stop there because it's going to be a long.
No, but what do you think of my argument?
You just have to say, again, you reached for
Not
the
convinced,
Kerala,
not
you reached for the Kerala box, right?
No, but why
And
shouldn't
there's
I? Why shouldn't I? It's not irrelevant.
No, it's not irrelevant.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there's political science that says very clearly,
Ah.
work by Atul Kohli, for example,
Yes.
that the conditions that produce whatever happened in Kerala do not exist in the rest of this country. You cannot have the sort of social forces that produce the Kerala transformation elsewhere. The conditions under which that can happen are so restrictive. You will not see that elsewhere in India. I'll stop.
Yeah, I just want to say, it's also been pointed out again by Drèze and Sen, that Tamil Nadu has achieved almost what Kerala has achieved in shorter time. And it's interestingly enough, it's also achieved in another part of the country, which is Himachal. And they put one of the conditions down to political competition. That's an interesting thing. And that's true of Tamil Nadu too, to some extent, the AIDMK, the DMK, etc. So I'm just trying to say, see what I said about political economy. I tend to be a bit of an empiricist.
Yeah.
And that hasn't kept me in too bad a state, I would say. So not at all.
And but we'll have to do some theoretical work to draw out some theoretical
Right, sure.
paradigms. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please.
So I want to ask actually, since in your book, you're talking about green revolution and agriculture as being the source of growth,
Right.
and therefore of poverty reduction.
In the mid 60s.
Right.
And the answer to Professor Singh's point about that was a time when growth slowed,
Right.
but actually poverty reduction accelerates. In fact, the first
Right.
time poverty reduction takes place in India.
Right. So if I can relate it to the Kerala story in general, when you're discussing the state level variations later on,
Correct.
one of the significant events that's mentioned is land reforms in Kerala.
Yes.
So can we think of the presence, if we think of the presence of land reforms in Kerala as being a good thing, can we think of the absence of it in the rest of the country as being something that hampered?
You could know without doubt.
the
But I think
achievements
if you
of
look at the
goods?
Kerala example, what land reforms really did was not really contribute to economic dynamism. It didn't contribute at all. And the markets have played a huge role in the development of Kerala economically, migration to the Gulf and the rest of India before that, etc. But I think land reform clearly destroyed the feudal social structure. And that all over the world, and here I draw on some theory, if I may, Barrington Moore, etc., believe that is the condition for the progress of democracy. You must have a destruction of the feudal order, and capitalism is what does that, and that way capitalism is good for the growth of democracy. So land reform certainly did, without doubt, do that in Kerala, and can do that globally, not globally, in the rest of India. But it is certainly severely constrained by political forces. The government of Tamil Nadu, which probably likes to see itself very progressive vis-a-vis Modi, etc., is not going to implement land reforms anytime soon, for instance.
Okay.
Yeah, leave alone the governments in the rest of the country.
So we have time for two more. We have Avanindra and, oh yes, over there first and then Avanindra. Please go ahead.
Yes, good afternoon, Professor. So you stated that Nehru and Modi cannot be compared, and later mentioned that the belief that Indian economic history starts in 1991,
Right.
is like that's obviously for reasons you mentioned and unfounded assumptions. My question pertains not so much to comparison as it does to a relation, which is that whatever economic policies were implemented between 1947 all the way up until 1991, especially till Nehru's death in 1964. How much of the economic aspects then affected what happened in 1991 and what has happened since then, as in the economic troubles of 1991 to say the least, and whatever development or in some areas the lack of it that has happened since then. So, drawing a comparison isn't fair, but what's the relation between what Nehru
Would you hold it and
started
then take this one?
Of course, sir. I'm sorry. In the last time I didn't. So
Yeah, that's all right.
yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. You're done with your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear to what extent is the economy path dependent.
Right.
Yeah, I have yet to read the book, but just larger question, that to what extent you think that India's quasi-federal structure or this entire centralization or decentralization discourse of policy implications was actually responsible for development or underdevelopment? Because on the one hand, when 1951 land reforms was reduced to a state subject, it happened to only a few states. It actually remained backseated. While because of decentralization or Kerala had its own experiment and all. What went wrong in that context, in Indian context basically? So what went wrong in this entire centralization or decentralization?
Okay, Professor
Political
Chatterjee
structure.
has a final question. Your mic isn't on, but you're audible.
So my question is regarding the two questions, small questions. One is regarding the lack of focus on education. So we are a democracy, right? So why is it that we don't demand education as normal citizens, civilians? Why is it? So Devesh Kapoor, he has a paper on that citizens are generally myopic. People, they might not want for something which is more long term. So what would be your views on it? Why is it that the state has consistently not focused on education and got done with it and got away with it? They continue to do so. And the second one is about this land reforms. There was small doubt. So Kerala had land reforms, but so did West Bengal to a certain extent. But West Bengal is no Kerala. It's very, very, so we see all the other problems which it has, similar. Yeah. So those are the two.
Thank you very much. I'll give. Can I take the last one first?
As
Because
you
it's
wish,
fresh
as
in
you
my
wish.
mind.
Yeah.
I don't know enough about the land reforms in West Bengal, but I can't help thinking. It's a superficial understanding. I can't help thinking from what I read and have read that land reforms in Bengal were probably not as favorite word, radical as in Kerala. It stopped with Operation Barga. Which is no more than regularizing tenancy. Would I be right? Did it? But no, regularizing tenancy is not land ownership, no?
Rights.
Tenancy, but it's
rights.
still not ownership. While in Kerala, land reform destroyed the feudal order. And so the social order is changed. In some way, one has to recognize, I think, and if you look at the history of other democracies, I think social distance must contract for there to be development. Only then can the general population demand of political parties the kind of policies that is going to improve their life, which is what I talked about. The social transformation is doing that, right? No, between classes, the elites and the rest of the population. Now, since we don't have time, let me answer the second question question. No, so the first question, very, very briefly. Well, I can't help thinking that my tribe, economists, have a huge deal of explanation to do on why the Indian state did not really invest in education. I can only think of two examples in this long period. One was exactly at the moment when the second plan was announced, 1956. A very young economist at the Bombay School, as it was called then, by name B.V. Krishnamurti, wrote a piece where it's very beautifully argued about how the government of India adopts the mindset of a Victorian grocer when it comes to education, while it prefers to splurge on river valley projects, obviously referring to Damodar Valley and Hirakud, etc., etc. But paltry sums in education. This is 1956. And the rest was by Sen in the mid-60s during the Green Revolution. There's a little debate between Sen and somebody by the name Hanumanta Rao, and Sen spoke about the low levels of education, etc. Sen was proved, and so Sen was skeptical of the Green Revolution being successful. He was proved wrong on that, but he's, I would think, proved completely right on the long-term trajectory of India. So now that takes me to the other question about what went wrong. I'm not sure if I understood this centralization, decentralization sufficiently well, but don't worry about that. I mean, at the cost of laboring that point, well, two things, not just one. One is severe error of omission, which is education. And the other is severe error of commission, which is populist use of controls. Ye mana hai, wo mana hai. You are not allowed to do this. Let loose the lower bureaucracy on, which is, I mean, you're seeing it in a more sophisticated way. It's not the lower bureaucracy, but of course, as a tax-paying citizen in this country, I'm outraged when money bags don't pay their taxes. But if you let loose the ED and the income tax bureaucracy on investors, you're going to have to pay. You will pay a price. So, but that is not new. The mistress of all this was Indira Gandhi, after all. I mean, so this is 60 years old in India. But controls have been used in a very, very populist way, whether it is used for governments of all hues and the severe error. By the way, I just want to say about education, the rest of it. Not only, it's kind of interesting, not only is human development higher in the West and the South, but level per capita incomes are also, which is somewhere, some kind of vindication of the idea that the ultimate constraint is education or schooling.
The final question over
there. Okay, thank you very much. I just want to say on 1991, I mean, there is no particular path dependence. The path dependence is very important, and you find that in the case of education. I just want to point out to you, even the strongest economies of the world have balance of payments crises. 1997, Korea. So their balance of payments crisis, you can lay many things at Nehru's store, but you can't blame the balance of payments crisis of 1991 at Nehru. That would be wrong. But there's one more question that you asked, which or a larger part of what you asked. So 1991, no, I would disagree with that completely. And I just want to give you an example. The strongest economies of the world can face balance of payments crises. Korea, 1997. It's a star economy, balance of payments crisis, because it didn't manage its balance payments. That is a short-term macro management problem. It has nothing to do with larger development policies.
Well,
you had one more point, but
my question more pertains to what happened after 1990.
I see. Okay, right. No, very good. Now here you'll be a bit. I just want to make the point that there is reason to believe that the policies in the Nehru era, in particular the Nehru-Mahalanobis strategy, as it's been called, did provide the underlying dynamic for growth since then. Growth may not have been very high, but that's your fault because you didn't make the interventions necessary. I mean, later governments, education being one of them, provision of infrastructure, but the dynamic was injected. Now, I, with two co-authors, Moshimi Das, who's a colleague of Aditya's at the Delhi School of Economics, and M. Parameshwaran of the Center for Development Studies at Trivandrum, we write down a model where when an economy is jolted out of a low-level equilibrium, it's set in motion, and there are mechanisms which will lead to continuous acceleration of the rate of growth. If I may request you to please look at the graph, and that's exactly what you see there. And we do find you can never really prove anything in the social sciences or in economics. So some economists walk around as if they have proven something. You can prove something mathematically, but I don't mean in terms of empirical results. But we also provide evidence to suggest, not suggest to, to argue that the mechanism that we suggest by which this acceleration has happened over time was set off in the 1950s.
So I don't think it'll be possible to summarize anything here. This has been wide-ranging, profoundly interesting. And so I can only ask my colleagues to join me in saying thank you. Before you go though, we like to say thanks in another more material way.
Oh, I'm an economist, so I'm not going to say, I won't say no. Oh, thank you very much.
Cameras are going.
Oh my God.
So it's getting cold now.
Yeah, thank you, absolutely. Thank you very much.
It's your next. Aditya.
Oh, I get one too.
Yeah.
For speaking 7 minutes.
Probably have quite a few.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
So you want to turn this way, maybe if you turn this way, so. All right, and then also one more pen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Naresh.
Thank you.
Very
I
nice
need it.
meeting you.
Great pleasure.
Wonderful. If you do get time to read the book, let me know what you think of it.
No, I
Really?
have.
You finished? Oh my God. Oh my God.
I read non-stop for 2 years. I have no choice.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
We have stands and small questions about
Hi.
it. So while arriving at the conclusion of the book, what was the most frequent modus operandi?
I don't know. I just write, yeah. I can pick up. I had the luxury of, not luxury of the kind of such a organized mind to do the kind of things. I just sit down and write.